I'm really delighted to welcome Fiona Berger to my home. Hi, Fiona.
Hi, thank you so much.
Fiona, you and I are going to be having a conversation about disability. How about starting off by telling us your story?
Well, my story really started when I was about 17. I woke up one morning, actually, it was a Shabbos morning, it just so happened, and I couldn't feel my legs. I could barely lift my head off the pillow, and really that's where it began. My parents happened to be at shul. I didn't grow up in a religious family, but a United Synagogue family. I went to United Synagogue schools. They happened to be at shul for a bas mitzvah, and I was laying in bed thinking, oh my gosh, I need to get up. I need to go to the bathroom. What am I going to do? My parents aren't here and I can't get out of
Gosh,
bed.
that's really awful.
It was a very, very scary place to be. So thankfully they came home. And I went to the hospital and I went through a series of testings of all different kinds of things. And eventually was basically told that there was nothing wrong with me. That I was a hypochondriac trying to get out of my exams, that I was overreacting and that I should just pull myself together.
That was the medical point of view?
That was the medical point
Wow.
of view. And so I was left as a young, very, vulnerable young person, being with all of these feelings or lack of feelings, in my legs, but being told there was nothing wrong with me, which left me feeling so lost because nobody was validating what I was feeling or seeing the struggles that I was having, and it made me feel like I was going crazy.
Gosh, so what happened next?
So I had periods where I was really unwell, and then periods where I would kind of recover somewhat. And it seemed to go in that kind of ebb and flow. I would have things like physiotherapy to help with, strengthening when I was having periods of unwellness. But there was no real medical intervention beyond those kinds of supportive therapies, I would say. Eventually I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue or ME. But even at the time it felt like it was an excuse because they couldn't really find what was really wrong, but they had to give it something.
Right. And within your family circle, were you receiving adequate support?
My family were amazing.
Great.
Actually, as a relatively rebellious or wayward teenager, it brought me and my mum much closer together. So there was definitely a silver lining. My parents were hugely supportive. I was volunteering at the time as a madracha in the local youth centre at St Clair House. I grew up in Essex. And they were hugely supportive. I used to go and volunteer in my wheelchair. They enabled me to be able to do that when there were periods when I couldn't walk so well. And yeah.
So when you arrived today and you walked through the door, thank God.
Thank God.
So, walking just about normally. So what happened between that time to bring us up to where we are today?
Quite a lot, actually, has happened. After I finished university, and I actually dropped out of school twice, my A-levels. I could not cope with being in school and the level of studying and being there every day. But I'd actually started a distance learning programme that was sponsored through the school and the community centre for a group of really dedicated volunteers, and it gave us a foundation studies in community education. And that's how I then got to university. And I stayed at home for I lived at home, but I was able to go to university and work. I was working in the community and doing different things. And again, having periods of being fine and periods of being not so fine. But with no real medical intervention.
Right.
Until after university, I went on a gap year to Israel. I was in seminary
Right.
And I had a big period, well, now I know it to be a relapse. And again, the seminary were amazing. And thank God I had travel insurance, because I saw some amazing doctors. And I was actually diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was in Israel.
That's just mind-boggling that all those years passed and it hadn't been diagnosed.
Absolutely. And so I remember the day sitting in the doctor's office. His name was Moshe Dickman. He was an amazing doctor. And he told me that I had multiple sclerosis. And I had such mixed emotions that day, because on one hand, finally, I was having this validation that all the things that I'd been feeling and experiencing for the last 5+ years were real.
Sure.
And there was a label and there was treatment and there was hope. But on the other hand, the label was a lifelong degenerative disease that was really scary.
Of course.
And so there was that conflict of emotions on the one hand, being totally relieved, and on the other hand, thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I'm in a foreign country without my family, and this is for life.
Wow. So what happened next?
So I came back home after the end of my year. I started on a treatment. I started on IV steroids that was then followed up with oral steroids, and that really got the relapse under control. And I came back to this country and went to a neurological hospital here, and I was told maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The diagnostic criteria in this country are different, and so they couldn't give me a definitive diagnosis, and so I couldn't access treatment here.
Oh gosh.
And so it wasn't actually until after the birth of my second daughter, which was about another 10 years later,
Wow.
that I got a diagnosis in this country. And when I did, the neurologist I saw was shocked, because it was so obvious. How could I not have been on treatment all this time?
Sure.
But the problem with multiple sclerosis is that in the beginning, when you first start having relapses, you recover quite quickly, and there's no real damage left. So you're not left with residual symptoms. You have a relapse where you're poorly, and then you recover and you're back to normal. But the more you have the relapses, the more residual damage is left, and so the more disability or struggles you're left with once you've recovered. And that's what's happened.
Okay. So you then, if I understand correctly, embarked on quite an ambitious journey in order to be helped.
So after the birth of my second daughter, I'd started on a disease-modifying drug, which was the standard treatment for MS in this country. It involved me injecting myself with a drug 3 times a week. I was on that for about a year, but continued to have relapses. And the idea of these disease-modifying drugs, or DMTs, is that they slow the progression of the disease, but they can't really stop it. Mm-hmm. So they aim to reduce the amount of relapses. Obviously, you're never really going to know if you would have had one or wouldn't have had one. But after about a year, I continued to have relapses, and so they changed the treatment I was on to a tablet. And during the following year, I had a very big relapse. My marriage broke down. Stress is a big contributing factor in MS, and I had a very, very big relapse. And so I was left with the thought of, okay, what am I going to do? I've got disability now. I'm facing being a single mum, and if I can't look after myself, how am I going to look after my children? And that was a really dark place to be. But previous to having that last relapse, I'd started going to an amazing support group called JDAIM, which is run by Jewish Care, and it's a support group for people with MS.
Okay.
And I thought going to that support group, it was going to be, I really wasn't sure about it, that it was just going to be a bunch of, you know, disabled people sitting around moaning about how terrible their life is. But there was something pushing me to go.
Right.
And so I went, and actually it was amazing. It was such a positive, supportive place. They had speakers that were, you know, relevant to the things that we were going through, that were interesting. Everyone was there to support each other, sharing information that they'd found, whether it was about new treatments or about how to get a blue badge or discounts you can get if you've got a blue badge or whatever it might be. It was just really an amazing place. And I'd met there a couple of people who had had HSCT, or which is effectively a stem cell transplant, and were doing really, really well.
Right.
And the benefit of a stem cells transplant is that it aims to stop the progression of the disease, whereas at the time none of the standardised drugs for MS could do that.
Sure.
So whilst I was recovering from this relapse in bed, I started to do research. And after a lot of research, I decided that, you know, that gave me the best chance of being independent, of being a mum to my kids.
Sure.
And so I started doing more detailed inquiries of where I could have the treatment and how, you know, how. So it turned out that the qualifying criteria to have that treatment on the NHS, were very stringent, and I didn't meet them. So I started looking into having it privately. In this country, it was going to cost upwards of £120,000, which I just didn't have. But there were other options going abroad to either Moscow or Puebla in Mexico. They were the two kind of main international centres.
Right.
And it was going to cost around £50,000, which is still a lot of money. And the treatment was not something to be undertaken lightly. It was a chemotherapy-based treatment, so, you know, with all of the effects of chemotherapy. So, but I was adamant that it was the right decision for me. My parents, not so much. They were very nervous.
Understandably.
And so I actually found a doctor in Liverpool who was running a trial doing this treatment, and I managed somehow to get myself an appointment with him. So my mum and I went off to Liverpool on the train, and really it was kind of part of the research to see whether he thought I would be a good candidate for the treatment and whether he had a place for me on his trial so I wouldn't have to find all of that money. And it was really a great trip because it gave my mum the opportunity to speak to the doctor and ask her questions, and it turned out that he did think I would be a good candidate for the treatment, but he could only offer me a place on his trial in 6 months from then.
Right.
And bearing in mind how quickly I was deteriorating at that point, I didn't feel that I had 6 months to wait. Mm-hmm. So on the train back from Liverpool, my mum and I started brainstorming of different ways we could fundraise the money because we just didn't have it. And so the campaign 50 for Fee was born because I'm Fiona, everyone calls me Fee, and we needed to raise £50,000 to go to Russia. It was Russia in the end that I decided was the right place to go. And so I started a campaign. I got a bunch of my closest friends together, and everyone was so supportive.
Wonderful.
And we crowdfunded the money to go.
That's amazing. So how many years ago was that?
That was I went to Russia in November 2018.
Okay, right. And thank God it was all worth it. I mean, brilliant to hear about the altruism of your friends, and I'm sure many other people, which is incredible. As you are speaking, I'm asking myself an enormous amount of questions relating to diagnostics and care and what's happening here in the UK. But if we just put that aside for a moment, amongst the sadness of what you have experienced, you referred to it earlier as silver linings. I'm seeing lots of silver linings. Your own determination, your own fortitude, your own resilience is just extraordinary. And you've got a band of really good people around you, which is just fantastic to hear.
I have to say that through the whole process, I really felt that it was the community that carried me through.
Wonderful.
I was in such a dark place, and I really, even my mum, who my whole life has been my biggest champion, she didn't think that we would do it, because when we came back from Liverpool, it was, I think, the end of July, and I'd been offered a place for November. So we really didn't have very long to raise that amount of money. And she was really concerned that I was going to be setting myself up to fail.
Yeah. So thank God for all that, and having been through what you've been through and continue to go through, because this is a lifelong journey for you, what would you say to others with disability with regard to the way that society views such people?
It's really hard because I am left with disability. You know, I wear a machine on my leg that helps me with my walking. If I'm walking any sort of distance, I use a stick. And now I totally own it. You know, the stick that I've got is beautiful. Actually, it's, you know, perspex, and it's got colour in it, and it's lovely. And I'm okay with it because it enables me to do what I want to do, and I feel empowered by it. But there was a long time where I didn't, and I was very self-conscious about how people would view me. And people do often take a double take, you know, because I don't look, just sitting here now, you wouldn't necessarily think there was anything wrong with me. And so if I'm you know, I have a blue badge. If I'm parking in a blue badge zone, people often do a double take, you know, is she really allowed to park there, or what's wrong with her?
So keeping stum or communicating, which one would you go for?
Personally, I would go for communicating. You know, as part of my campaign to raise money, I made a very conscious decision that I was going to talk about my condition, and I talk about it whenever I can, because I think that the more things are out in the open, the more people know that they're not alone, you know. And since starting my campaign, so many people have reached out to me and said, oh, I'm going through this, or my sister or my friend or whoever. And I think that that's amazing, because when anyone is going through any kind of challenge, the worst thing is to feel that you're the only one and you've got no one to share the burden with, or no one to, I don't know, feel the camaraderie with. And so the more we talk about these things, the more support we can give each other. Absolutely.
I can definitely understand some people who would prefer the world not to know what's happening, and it's part of the strength that they have, wanting the world out there to presume that they are conducting their lives in a regular fashion. But your message is speak, communicate, and your experience is it works because people understand, and thank God the world is full of wonderful people.
Absolutely. And I think in the beginning I was one of those people. People with chronic illnesses are often very, very good at gritting their teeth and getting on with it and struggling through with letting the outside world know as little as possible about what their struggle is. And one of the things I realised when I was going through that last relapse was that actually there was an army of people there in the starting blocks waiting to help, wanting to help, and they just didn't know what to do. And as soon as I overcame that barrier in myself to say, actually, I need help, it came flooding in from places I wouldn't have even imagined. And so the way that I kind of changed it in my head was that I was helping them to help me.
Right.
And that's really what I had to do. So I was kind of doing a mitzvah, enabling them to do a mitzvah,
Sure.
if you know what I mean.
Now, Fiona, what advice would you give to, let's call it society, with regard to people with disability? Bearing in mind your experiences and the knowledge you have of the experience of others, what are we as a society getting right, and in what ways are we getting things wrong?
So I think it's kind of twofold. I think there's a responsibility on the person living with disability to be able to articulate and ask for what they need when they need it. But I think that there's also a big responsibility on communities that know their people, you know, to try and preempt as many of those needs as they can before the person needs them. Because any person living with any kind of disability doesn't want to feel like they're wearing a badge around their neck the whole time. I'm disabled, I need help.
Sure.
And so if we can preempt some of those needs, or as many of them as we reasonably can, before they're at the point of needing them, so that they can engage in whatever activity it is in the same way that everybody else would, without having to even think about whatever disability or struggle or impairment they might have, then we're empowering people to participate, and that's really a positive thing. So I think there has to be responsibility on both sides.
Are there ways in which well-meaning people actually get on your nerves?
Personally, no.
You're a very good person, by the way. Because my presumption was your answer would be, oh boy, yes. But I can see you're a lovely, good person.
Well, I don't know. I think that it's just that my disability isn't that obvious. So I'm not the sort of person that people will come rushing up to help across the road. Yeah. But there's a lovely lady that I know that is in her 90s, and she has become a little bit more unstable on her feet, and she often tells me, how grateful she is that people, when she's crossing the road, are there to help.
Yeah.
And she lives in Hendon. She's and that quite astounded me, because that's not really the experience that I have. But again, it's because maybe it's just because it's not so obvious. People would expect to help an older lady across the road, but wouldn't necessarily think to help someone like me.
Fiona, in terms of our synagogues, what are we getting right and what are we getting wrong?
So I think that there's a lot that we're getting right, but if we're looking at ways that we can improve, I think it's about, first of all, making sure that people know what accessibility functions you have in place already. So that it's great if you have them, but if people don't know about them, they might not as well be there. So it's important that people know what's available. I think that if you have the ability to have ramps or other aids to help access, whether it's a Shabbat lift or anything else, again, that people know about them, and that they're available, that they don't have to go and find someone to open it or make it work, that they're there. I know that lots of our shuls have sensory boxes for people with neurodivergence, or things that, they might have things like magnifying glasses inside, or toys to fiddle with, or ear defenders if it's too loud, so they can be really great. And I think that things like announcing page numbers for people who either have a visual impairment or a hearing impairment or that struggle just keeping up with the service and knowing, it helps people to feel included. And so as well as announcing it, if it's possible to have, a sign with the page number, that can also be really helpful, so that if people can't hear so clearly, that they can see. And I think the one last thing I would say is that thinking about, if you have a seating plan in shul, or if people have assigned seating, thinking about the needs of those people and where they're placed. When that could be in shul or it could be for an event. But if you know that somebody has a hearing impairment and it's helpful for them to lip read, then seating them in a place where they can clearly see the person speaking is going to be helpful. Or if someone's got young children who like to run around, or they need to get out to use the bathroom regularly, seating them in a place where that's, we want to make it as easy for people as possible. And so having those conversations and thinking about some of these things in advance can really make people feel seen and remove some of those stumbling blocks from in front of them.
Would you say it's a good idea to have a go-to person in every shul, a kind of disability officer? Do you think there's merit in that idea?
I absolutely do. I think that if there's a go-to person whose business it is to know people and get to know them and what their needs are, and there's a person that people know to go to say, actually, my needs are changing, or, I've had an accident and I've got a broken leg and this is what I need, even if it's for a fixed period of time, I think having someone that's responsible for that people know who to go to and where to get the help is really important. Because the worst thing is if you need help and you're ready to ask for it but you don't know who to ask, that can be a really scary thing if you have to then go and ask 5 different people to get, your feeling exposed for no reason.
And maybe you can relate to us an experience you might have had or somebody else might have had where people didn't know that they were disabled and therefore were quite judgmental.
So my sister also has MS.
Gosh, that you just kind of said that, but that's something mega.
It's quite uncommon. It's quite uncommon.
But older or younger sister?
Younger.
Right.
Well, she's my big little sister.
And how's she doing?
She's doing okay, thank God.
Okay, thank God.
She's taken a different path in terms of treatment than I did, because that's what fitted her life and that's what she felt was right for her. And it's interesting because if you compared us, our symptoms are totally different. You would think that we had totally different illnesses. And that's one of the things with MS, that because of the nature of the illness and how it affects the body, no two people present in exactly the same way.
So you were going to tell me something about your sister in a synagogue.
So we were in a United Synagogue for a family simcha. My grandpa, who I can give a little shout out to, he'll be very chuffed. Grandpa Monty. Grandpa
Monty, I understand, turned 100.
He did.
That's
he turned
quite
100
something.
In the summer.
Yeah.
So we were in shul. This was a few years ago, and it was not long after she'd been diagnosed. So for her, it was still very raw. And she struggled a lot with her walking and her mobility. She suffers with chronic pain a lot. And so standing for long periods of time is very hard for her. She'd made quite a long journey to come to shul to be there in the beginning, in the first place. And so when the Aron Kodesh was open, she didn't stand up every time. Like, she did as much as she could, but if she couldn't, she didn't.
Sure.
Fair enough.
Sure.
But unfortunately, a gentleman from downstairs had noticed that she wasn't standing and decided to take it upon himself to come upstairs and tell her that she should be standing when the Aron Kodesh was open. She was absolutely devastated by that.
Did she explain?
She was bereft. She didn't really know how to handle it. And she shouldn't have had to explain, really. It was nothing to do with this man. But the fact that he felt propelled to come upstairs and tell her, it was really quite shocking. And it wasn't from a place of concern to say, I've noticed you're sitting, is everything okay? How can we help you?
Increasingly, I'm noticing announcements being made such as, will all those who are able please stand? Do you welcome?
Absolutely. I think that that's really important. I think it's important for so many reasons, because number one, it helps people who maybe have a visual impairment or a hearing impairment and are not following the service in the same way, to know what's expected of them when. But also it gives the whole community an understanding that not everyone is able to stand. And I'm sure that if my sister had been a 90-something-year-old lady who wasn't able to stand, he wouldn't have felt compelled to run up the stairs in the same way. But I think we need to put that element of compassion in. You know, not everyone is able to read. Not everyone has that connection with davening or praying in the same way. And I think that we need to just be a little bit more understanding that if somebody's made the effort to come to shul or come to a community event, we don't know what went into that journey of how much effort did it take for them to get there first, or what it is that they're dealing with. And we all just need to worry a little bit less about how other people are engaging, I think. Sure. And making sure that if we've got something to say, that we're coming at it from the right reasons. Because if he'd have come up and said, are you okay? Do you need help? Can we assist you in some way? Her whole experience would have been totally transformed.
Sure. You mentioned GEMS before. Are there ways in which our community can do better in the services that are provided for those who are disabled? Or do you think we're in a good place?
So there is lots of support out there for people if they want it. Not everybody does.
What more can be done to encourage people to use the good facilities that are there? You relayed to us before how, there was something inside you driving you to go to GEMS, which is run by Jewish Care, and which is amazing, but you might not have decided to do that. So how can we get more people into these facilities?
So I think awareness is a big part of it, and I think that the crux of it comes from if you're part of a community, whether it's a shul community or you go to a community centre or a day centre. I think that there is a big responsibility on the people that work and run those centres to know their people and to get to know them and to understand what their needs are, and so that they can then signpost them in different ways of things that might be useful or helpful or assist them in some way. Sure. So that they can then, as an organisation or as a community, support their needs, whether it's coming to shul, so that they can preempt those needs, like we said before they need them. Or it can be, have you heard of this group, or have you heard of this person who's, and that's really what community is about, isn't it? That we're looking out for each other and saying, oh, did you hear about this? Or this person really benefited from that. Would it help you?
You were speaking earlier about an incident in one of our United Synagogue shuls. To your knowledge, what is the United Synagogue doing in order to prioritize the needs of people with disability?
Well, I think the most important thing that the United Synagogue is doing is the fact that they now have an inclusion lead. We have a whole department dedicated to ensuring that people can access our communities, our shuls, our events, our services in a way that's right for them, and that there's a go-to person for shul staff or honorary officers or rabbonim and rebbitzins to contact if they're not sure the best way of how to support someone in their community.
Wonderful.
We have people to guide and support them through it.
Fiona, do you want to ask me anything? I know we're kind of turning things around.
So I think my first question would be, there's lots of characters from the Torah that have various impairments or disabilities. What is it? Is there some sort of guidance from the Torah that you can pull out for us that helps us to navigate some of these issues in how we support people living with disability in the community?
That's a major theme in the Torah, and there are many instances of people with disability, perhaps most often visual disability. But for me, the most striking example, in order to answer your question, is in the book of Exodus chapter 4, where at the burning bush, Hashem says to Moses, go back to Egypt and lead the Israelites therefrom. And Moses gives various reasons why he shouldn't, but his most powerful one is, Lo ish dvarim anochi. I'm not a man of words, because he said he had a speech impediment. And therefore, it was as if he was saying to Hashem, God, you've got the wrong guy here. I'm not up to this. And God's reply conveyed two very powerful and important messages. The first was he wouldn't hear this about not being up to it, right? He was putting his trust in Moses to become the greatest leader that he eventually became. And sometimes people can achieve much despite their disability, and sometimes it's because of their disability if they embrace it and move forward constructively. And that was Hashem's first message to Moses. The second message was, Aaron's going to come, v'hu yelech alepeh, and he will be your mouthpiece. Don't worry, you will have assistance in order to convey your message. And I think that bears out one of your key messages. People do want to help, and you can be exceptionally effective in what you want to do, even though you have your disability, because amongst those around you, they will be there to guarantee that you can be yourself. And from what I'm hearing from whatever you're saying is, we as a society need to enable disabled people to be themselves in their space according to the way that they want to run their lives, with the right level of support and understanding and empathy.
Absolutely. It's so important. And it's so interesting what you said. I saw a meme actually the other day that said, how do you get through difficult times in your life? And it said, well, if Hashem opened your eyes in the morning, he believes in you. Now you have to believe in yourself. And I think that's the
Great.
same kind of message, that we have to believe in ourselves, and we have to believe in the people that are around us, and lean on them when we need to.
Okay. Fiona, I found this conversation inspirational. Sorry to embarrass you, I think you're an amazing person. And your story is sad, but it's also very uplifting. And God bless you, that you should have good health, and your sister, and everybody else out there.
Amen.
And thank you so much for giving me this privilege to have this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.